Hi everyone and welcome to the Racial Justice webinar. My name's Tripta and I'm joined by my colleagues Rebecca, Ugo and Jamie, who've all been working on the Racial Justice Fund. Today I'll be chairing and facilitating this webinar. So if you have any questions, please feel free to pop them in the Q&A section at the bottom. We've decided to do a webinar because we've had quite a lot of interest so far, with over 100 people signing up to today's session and the session earlier this week. We will also give an opportunity at the end of the session to kind of go through those questions, but also you're able to book a one-to-one call with a grant manager next week. So we'll be sending out details in an email, and it will also be on our website. So you can follow up with any kind of individual questions you may have around eligibility. We'll also be putting a recording of this website online, so you can also get a copy of kind of what was discussed and a copy of the slides too. So we should just get started now, if that's okay. I'll run through the agenda. So the agenda for today is we'll just give some background information on Trust for London, some background information on racial and economic justice and why we've decided to go down this route, and then more details around the eligibility of the fund, its aims and objectives, and then also information around the funded partners that we provided funding to in round one, as well as kind of any lessons and learnings that have come out. We'll go through the timetable and then again some room for some Q&As. So Trust for London, so we're an independent grant-making organisation working to reduce poverty and inequality in London. We've funded over 300 organisations at any one given time. And in 2018 and to 2022, we awarded 814 grants totaling £66 million. Some of you may know that we're currently reviewing our grant strategy with programs to be launched in 2024. So we're currently only open for continuation grants, as well as the Racial Justice Fund and Disability Justice Fund, which will be opening soon. Our core working areas consist of programs around housing, migration, decent living standards, employment, shared wealth, and some of the activities we fund based on those programs are providing funding for frontline specialist advice, advocacy and campaigns, building the collective voice of people with first-hand experience and research. We also have special initiatives like the Racial Justice Fund, Disability Justice Fund, but also in temporary accommodation, citizenship and integration, and our Moving On Up programme. We also have social investment strand of our grant making, so supporting pioneering projects and social enterprises, which my colleague Ugo can talk about in a bit more detail. So I'll now hand over to Ugo and Rebecca, who can talk a bit more about the fund.
Thank you very much, Tripta. So good morning, everyone. Welcome once again, and thank you very much really for taking time out of your busy schedules. I know how the work that some of you are doing, and so thank you for attending this webinar. And as my colleague said, Tripta, I will spend the next 20 minutes just talking through the aims, the objectives, and the eligibility and the outcomes of this fund. Most of what I will say is already in the guidance, so I'm not necessarily going to be introducing new information, but hopefully it will be an opportunity to just provide more clarity around the fund itself, and really, as my colleague Tripta said, give you the opportunity to ask questions. We will employ the wisdom of Jethro here, so between myself and my colleague Rebecca, we will sort of split that between us. But before I do that, just a sort of quick kind of update or more information on social investment. So in addition to our grant making, we also have funding available for organizations, social enterprises, charities who are considering alternative models to grant funding. For those who don't know, social investment, it's basically a form of repairable finance. It follows a similar process to grant making. The difference is that the money or the fund is repairable, depending obviously on each organization's return expectation. There are two really interesting things that we're doing in social investment. One is around participatory social investment. We're working with an organization called Shift to reimagine and to rethink our approach to social investment. Our hypothesis is that if we increase the number of people from underrepresented, underserved, minoritized, racialized backgrounds in social investment, particularly around decision making, so shifting power in decision making, then that would, to some extent, address some of the market failures around the lack of the flow of capital to minoritized Black communities. So that's really interesting. It also follows really nicely with a piece of work we're doing along with City Bridge Trust and Esme Fairbairn around the London Impact Fund. We're exploring the possibility of designing a fund focused in London that would support diverse organizations with funding, capacity building, and whatever they need to scale up and to develop their enterprises. So that's it on social investment. I'll move swiftly on to the racial justice, racial and economic justice fund, and to just kind of give you a bit of background and context as to how we developed this fund and kind of why we're here, the rationale for it. So obviously back in 2020, Trust for London, we committed for the first time to do work on racial justice directly. And I say that because we have historically always worked within this area. We've probably done work around racial equity, more so around immigration, advice, asylum seekers, and some of the other initiatives moving on up, for example, which is about, supporting young Black men specifically into employment. But we've never done work that we've named specifically as racial justice. And so this is, really important for us. The stage obviously for this had been set by the pandemic, which, as we all saw, resulted in extremely high hospitalization rates, learning loss, death rates, elevated unemployment. And whilst this was true everywhere, the impact in each instance was probably more severe in communities of color, in Black and minoritized communities, which, as we all know, is a product of the systemic nature of racism, which affects everything from access to housing and home ownership to employment, wealth acquisition, and more. And when you look across our key program areas, such as Better Work, Pathways to Settlement, Good Homes and Neighborhoods, they are not necessarily immune also from these effects. And although the murder of George Floyd, which is another part of the story, the confluence of all of that was the public impetus, I would say, for us and many other trusts and foundations to take action, our commitment was also motivated by other sources as well. We looked internally at our data, looked at the number of Black and minority-led organizations that we have funded. The data clearly show that we hadn't done enough in that area. And so through our existing work, we've been able to enhance our understanding of the racial dimensions of wealth inequality and the extent to which that inequality is born out of structural issues. But I would say that despite that advancement or the advances in our understanding of such a complex problem, the sector largely continues to approach the issue solely through this individual asset building lens rather than from a perspective that addresses the historical and the systemic racial exclusions, I think, that prevents and continues to prevent Black and minoritized communities from building wealth over many generations. And so for us, this was really the impetus and the foundation to kickstart this. And so we launched last year, May 2020, in partnership with the City Bridge Trust, who also have a long-term strategic commitment to this. This fund was designed from the get-go. Our thought process was very much about co-design, and this is about doing it with, not necessarily to, the community, trying to address some of the harmful practices that philanthropy has had on Black and minoritized organizations, on Black and minoritized communities. And so we had a panel of people representative from the community who really helped to shape this fund. Alongside that, we also have the lived and the learned experience of our staff and trustees. And so in the first round, which was launched last year, we made 6 grants to organizations working across a number of different areas. And the total of that was just under 1 million. So there is still quite a substantial amount of money to give away in this round. But we will stress that we are after quality over quantity. And so to give you kind of a bit more context as to the whole assessment framework, the process, in total, we got 125 expressions of interest. So there are 2 stages to the program. In the first instance, we received 125 EOIs. We shortlisted that down to 11 organizations, which we then invited to apply to the second stage. Of those 11 that we took to assessment, we shortlisted 7 of them, which we took to panel, and we ended up awarding 6 of those. And so I want to talk a bit about the objectives of this work. Our focus, as we've said, is on tackling racial injustice, and to do that in order to reduce poverty in London's Black and minoritized communities. Through campaigning, through research, through advocacy, through influencing, we want to be able to change policy and practice on disparities across a number of different areas that we think impact on Black and minoritized communities. So whether that's housing, employment, social welfare. We know that today wealth inequality holds constant across all income levels. Black and minoritized communities, the data is there, still only have a small fraction of the wealth that's held by their white counterparts. And so for us, part of being able to close that racial wealth gap and enabling Black and minoritized communities to build wealth and to sustain that is going to require us acknowledging and addressing the various historical and some of the current drivers of racialized wealth inequities, some of which have traditionally always been part of the conversations around, racial wealth gap. So things like intergenerational transmission of wealth or the lack thereof for Black minoritized communities, exclusions from the labor market, housing, and just a range of wealth stripping mechanisms that disproportionately deprive Black and minoritized communities of wealth and drive them further into debt. And so we've got 2 objectives, or rather we're framing this under the 2 objectives. One is around increasing household income in Black and minoritized communities. When we talk about income, what we're saying here essentially is the amount of money that households earn, whether that's through employment rethinking, policies around employment. We also know that real wealth is not just about material wealth, and real poverty is not just about the lack of food, clothing, and shelter, but real wealth really is about access to power and resources that help people determine the kind of lives that they want to lead. And secondly, we talk about increasing the amount of household and community wealth in Black and minoritized communities. When we talk about that, again, we mean the value of the assets that households within Black and minoritized communities hold. Again, just on that, I think for us, community wealth building has to be something that's reparative, it's inclusive, it delivers for those, for me, who have been historically excluded and exploited. It's more of a system changing approach to community economic development that really works to produce broadly shared economic prosperity and racial justice by reconfiguring or rethinking local institutions, local economies on the basis of that greater democratic ownership and participation. It's about a community being able to self-determine, not gentrification, as an example. And so we need to disrupt that status quo. For example, if I use housing, just the way real estate development currently works, we need to shift power away from corporations, from investors and developers who have no real stake in our neighborhoods, to everyday people. And so it's about reimagining how, in that instance, how that works. I thought it would be helpful to just talk about some of the terminologies that we've used in the guidance and for this fund. In doing this work, one of the things we recognize is that we wanted to avoid generalizations. At the same time, we also think it's important for us to really recognize and to acknowledge that multiple ethnic groups can face significant challenges and disparities. And so hence our reference to Black and minoritized communities. We are very mindful of the impact of racial and economic injustice. And we know that it's not uniform and it can vary across different contexts, different regions. And so focusing on Black and minoritized communities, we think is important for several reasons. Historically, Black communities, as an example, have been disproportionately affected by systemic racism, by discrimination, and economic disparities. Additionally, we think focusing on Black communities really acknowledges the unique experiences and the struggles that they face. Racial and economic injustice often intersects, it creates these complex barriers to opportunities, to wealth accumulation, and to social mobility. And so by centering our efforts on Black and minoritized communities, we can develop really targeted solutions and policies to address these disparities. And so hence why we've used the terminologies that we have. There is no sort of science behind it. We just feel it's respectful to the communities that we look to support through this. So in terms of the criteria, very quickly, really essential. We've sort of split the criteria into two. One is essential, the other is the sort of prioritized. So for the essential criteria, this follows our normal grants program, and organizationally, this is the lens through which we sift and we assess applications. So it's really important that whatever your legal status, you have at least 3 trustees or directors. Because of our regional geographical focus, we insist that the work that's been proposed takes place in London or it benefits Londoners. You don't necessarily need to be a registered charity, but you do need to be undertaking charitable activities, and that can be found within your memorandum and articles of association. It could be you have things like a social mission log, etc., that shows that you are undertaking charitable activities. If you're a company, if you're a CIC, you must have at least one unpaid independent director, someone who is able to provide a level of scrutiny and be a sounding board, really check and challenge to the organization, someone who's got the knowledge, the skills, the expertise to really scrutinize the organization's finances and governance. So either that, or you could, I've seen in some cases where organizations who are CICs have also set up advisory boards to help provide that additional layer of governance. In terms of our prioritized criteria, we say that organizations have to have a significant track record of working on issues of racial justice and economic empowerment. We do say organizations should be majority led by Black and minoritized communities, and by majority led, what we're saying here is that 75% of your trustees come from the very community that you are representative or is reflective of the community, and or 50% of your senior staff. That said, we are flexible around that because we recognize that there are organizations who may have a significant track record of working on issues of racial justice and economic empowerment, but are not necessarily representative in terms of the makeup of their governance, whether that's staffing or board. However, we're interested in having conversations to understand organizations' individual situations. How are they working with that community? What sort of arrangements? What is their sense of, not just EDI, but how do they approach issues of racial justice and economic empowerment? How are they making sure that the work they're doing is not extractive, but takes a very inclusive approach to those communities? Again, we're really interested in work that has an intersectional approach. So it could be race and disability, race and gender. Really, yeah, interesting for us. Applications where organizations are working in partnership to whether that's to strengthen joint work on specific issues. And we say this because part of our aspirations for this fund is that at the end of it, we really want to resource more collaborative approaches to tackling and to addressing the issues around racial injustice and economic empowerment. So we're really looking to prioritize not necessarily those applications, but it will be important to see that within your applications. In terms of some of the examples of activities that we may fund, this is not an exhaustive list. Within the guidance, we've also provided some examples of the sorts of things that we're potentially interested in. As we've said here, it could be community wealth building, programs and policies around how do we reconfigure institutions and local economies based on that sense of greater democratic ownership, participation, control. Is there, looking across the pond, we know that there is really interesting things happening in the US, and the US are probably a bit more advanced in terms of racial justice and economic empowerment. So, is there the potential for a government retirement savings act? We know that many people from Black and minoritized communities are typically stuck in low paid work in the gig economy. And the resultant effect of that is that many don't have access to retirement. We know that that's potentially both a driver of poverty and wealth. And so is there something here for the government to do? Can we get some sort of consensus around this, where there is a requirement for employers with 10 employees or more to contribute a certain amount to a portable retirement fund for those types of employees? Is there something around access to capital? We know that access to capital is a significant barrier. It's a fundamental barrier to creating wealth and poverty within Black and minoritized communities. So is there policies? Can we advocate for policies that give access and control to capital at scale? When I think about that, I think about things like dormant assets, for example, the money that comes from dormant assets. Is there a campaign around ensuring that that money flows down into Black and minoritized communities? We know that improving housing outcomes for Black and minority ethnic groups is a really, really important driver of addressing poverty, increasing wealth. So stuff around social housing, privately rented housing, home ownership. How do we increase prospects for home ownership for people from Black and minoritized communities? So these are just examples of the sorts of things. And I think what you would find running through all of this, the common thread is the focus on the sort of systems level of change, working at that level, the upstream stuff, and not necessarily a focus on individuals. I'll leave my colleague to talk a bit more about that, but I hope that's helpful. Some of the other things we've potentially looked at, is there something around the institution of more Black cooperatives or Black credit unions to try to address some of that lack of flow of capital within Black and minoritized communities? So I'll hand over to my colleague, Rebecca, to sort of move us on. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Ugo. Could you move it back one, because I think there should be a slide what we cannot fund. There we go. So yeah, get back up one. That's it. Great. We haven't done that slide yet. Is that the right one? Yes, brilliant.
Yes,
so
right
thanks, Ugo. And again, kind of just reiterating, thank you everyone for joining us today. I can see quite a few people have joined since we started. So just to reiterate, the slides will be available online, and also we'll put a recording of the webinar online as well. So in terms of what we cannot fund, so the Racial Justice Fund, and this is where we got a lot of applications in the last round that unfortunately we had to decline, that were around service delivery, which we had sort of requests for grants to fund advice work, mentoring, and that's not quite the kind of thing that we're looking for under the Racial Justice Fund. And then also just to kind of recap in terms of the policy areas. So at the start, we highlighted housing, employment, sort of living standards, social security. What we don't fund is sort of work around mental health support, well-being, sort of general well-being, sports programs. Those are the sorts of things that don't currently fall under our kind of priority areas. So on the right-hand side of the slide, we've got a kind of list of things we cannot fund in terms of eligibility, and this is all part of our shortlisting criteria, which is in the guidelines. So we can't take applications from individuals, from mainstream public services, from organisations that have fewer than 3 people on their governing body. We can't fund work for the promotion of religion, but we do fund organisations that might have a religious purpose. But the work that we fund can only be around tackling poverty and inequality, and also needs to be available to all. We can't fund general appeals or for work that's already taken place. And we don't tend to fund organisations that hold a significant amount in free reserve. So we also can't fund organisations in serious financial deficits or for capital costs. Next slide, please, Ugo. Thank you. So I'm just going to run through some examples of some of the EOIs that we declined in round 1, just to give you an example of some of the things that we were unable to take forward. So the first example here was funding for a manager post to help train and facilitate and tutor sort of sewing training for low-income women from Bangladeshi backgrounds. And the reason why we couldn't fund it was focused on upskilling individuals and working with individuals and working with retailers to develop ethical supply chains. And so the focus was on work experience and employability and supporting individuals directly, whereas the fund is around kind of looking at some of those broader kind of policy and practice areas that need to change to be able to build the financial empowerment of racialized communities. The second example was for a project to work with young people to develop a kind of specific product or project that they could then market and generate income from. And again, this was focused on individuals and wasn't looking at some of those barriers that can lock whole communities out of financial wealth and security. And in the Q&A, I can see somebody's asked, does this fund support income generation via self-employment? So unfortunately not, that isn't the sort of thing that would fit within the fund. So example 3, we had quite a few applications like this that were around leadership development with individuals. And again, this work is much needed, it's important, but that kind of specific focus on individuals, we feel didn't quite look to some of those broader barriers. So working with employers, looking at kind of policy, and some of those kind of bigger questions about what needs to change. Example 4, we had a request for a development grant to support a consortium of groups who work with older people, families, youth disability. Now that kind of intersectional lens and approach, that's really important, but unfortunately the application wasn't strong enough in terms of identifying what kind of activities, what campaigns, what are the areas that they'd be seeking to change. So in terms of kind of an overview of the funding and the grants, we are open, we're sort of flexible, we're open to core or project funding. but it would be restricted for the purpose of tackling racial justice and building economic empowerment. If you put in a request for core funding, we still need to understand the kind of work that the funding would support, and kind of understand how you'd be tackling racial injustice, and how you'd be seeking to build a kind of economic empowerment. In terms of level of funding, we're open to giving grants of up to 5 years. As a guide, in the first round, we funded 6 organisations from a period of 2 to 5 years, with I think the smallest grant being around 50,000 and the largest grant being around 248,000. We are open to development grants. So this might be if you're working to build a kind of consortium or a kind of network, and you want to sort of work up a sort of fuller proposal and test approaches. If you're thinking about a development grant, it'd be really good to talk to you about that and make sure that you you flag that up in the application as well. In terms of the shortlisting criteria, all of these are in the funding guidelines, so do go back and have a look there. In terms of decision making, the final decision on applications will be made by a group of Trust for London staff and trustees, which includes co-opted trustees, and that does include people from Black and minoritized backgrounds. We've had a bit of turnover in terms of our trustees and grants panel members, so we're just reappointing the grants panel at the moment from our kind of trustees and co-optees. So just to recap in terms of what we're trying to achieve. So in terms of the fund, we want people from Black and minoritized communities to have access to power and resources needed to create economic wealth. It's around stronger alliances and movements of communities working to influence and shift policy. We want to see increased income and economic wealth, and reduced racial and economic inequalities caused by racialization. So in terms of the things that we funded, it's around research, it's around advocacy, campaigns, it's around work that is driven by people with first-hand experience of poverty. That's a really kind of key thing for us. Just to give you an example of some of the funded partners, Money A&E were awarded a grant, and their proposal came in as a partnership application between Money A&E and Rooted Finance. And they're looking to build a financial empowerment alliance. And there's 2 aspects to that work. One is around improving access to financial products and services, and the other is around changing employment practices to improve kind of representation within financial services jobs. And what was really good about that application and the work that they're proposing is around partnerships. It's around kind of work that's driven by people with first-hand experience. It's around advocacy and campaigns. It's a 5-year program. And that kind of and it also both organizations do that kind of frontline delivery work, and it's around translating that frontline experience into trying to sort of change the systems and kind of barriers that Black and minoritized Londoners are facing. So another example was Southall Community Alliance, and they will be working to kind of build community assets within Southall. And the idea was to kind of build resources and build kind of information and campaigns and the kind of, to kind of take ownership of those community assets. Next slide, please. So Runnymede Trust, that is work around kind of housing. So they're doing sort of research to look at the barriers to home ownership that stifles economic growth for Black and minoritized communities in London. Latin Elephant, that focus on, so Latin Elephant have been a really sort of successful organisation and campaign, and what they're now looking to do is kind of build the power of a kind of broader range of migrant and racialised communities to campaign against gentrification. Community Barnet, so that's a grant over 2 years to research the barriers that local Black businesses are facing, and then to sort of build a kind of network, partnerships, and to kind of build a campaign for change. There's the New Black Film Collective, so we provided a smaller development grant to build the capacity of the organisation to kind of work on closing the sort of gap in terms of pay and career progression for Black teachers compared to their white counterparts. So in terms of the timetable, we have slots available for the next couple of weeks. If they all get filled up, we'll open more. But Tripta, Ugo and myself if you go online later today, but we'll also be sending the link out, you'll be able to book in a 30-minute call with one of us, and we'd be really happy to talk to you about sort of eligibility and about the priorities of the fund. And then we have the deadline for EOIs is Monday, the 16th of October. And then you should hear back from us by sort of within kind of 4 to 6 weeks. Yeah, and then so that timetable is online and in the guidelines as well.